I was leaning against the kitchen counter, absent-mindedly stirring my coffee, when the silence of the night was broken by the sound of footsteps. It was close to midnight, and the entire house felt like it was holding its breath, with only the faint glow of streetlights streaming in through the windows to break the darkness. She stepped into the room slowly, almost hesitantly, as if she had something to share, but wasn't sure if she should. My half-brother stepsister, or just stepsister as everyone called her, stopped a few paces away. Her face was partly hidden in shadow, but her eyes were locked on mine with an intensity one couldn't quite place. The quiet between us hung heavy in the air. We had crossed paths countless times in this house since our parents got married, usually exchanging friendly jokes or small talk about school, work, or whatever else came to mind. But this moment, this was different. Something unspoken seemed to hang in the air, charged with tension, and I couldn't shake it, even as I forced myself to look away. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet it barely broke the silence. "We need to talk," she said, her tone more serious, softer than I'd ever heard it. She was nervously twisting her fingers together, as though she was still trying to summon the courage to continue. The words came out haltingly, almost painfully, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her so vulnerable. There was no playful smile, no usual glint in her eye, just an uncertainty that seemed to tremble in the dim light. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at her, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to shrug it off, maybe laugh at how awkward the whole situation felt. But something in her expression stopped me. It was like she was standing on the edge of something, about to take a leap, and all she needed was a little push. It was shocking, almost surreal. I could feel my heart racing as the weight of the moment sank in. I wasn't ready for this. Whatever this was. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even despite the growing tension. I knew it was probably a pointless question. The look on her face told me this was serious, something that had been building for longer than I could have ever anticipated. As I waited, I noticed a slight tremor in her hand, the hesitation in her posture only adding to the intensity of the moment. She didn't answer. Her gaze fell to the floor, lips pressed tight, as if the words she needed to say were stuck somewhere deep inside. Then, with a quiet exhale, she finally met my eyes again. Her stare was intense, almost pleading, and I felt an invisible weight pressing down on me. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The urgency in her tone sent a shiver through me. I'd always seen her as a friend, someone I'd gotten used to over time, but the vulnerability in her eyes was something new, something that made me want to reach out, to comfort her, even though I had no idea what she was going through. I forced myself to stay calm, not jumping to conclusions, but the air between us was thick with unspoken words. I could feel myself being drawn into the gravity of her confession, even though I still had no clue what she was about to say. My mind raced, replaying old conversations, trying to find some clue, some hint of what was going on. But I came up with nothing. In the silence that stretched out between us, I could feel my breath catch, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but words escaped me. Instead, I just nodded, trying to show her I was listening, that I was there even though I didn't understand. After a long pause, she took a cautious step closer, her gaze unblinking. "I've been holding on to this for a while," she said, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. "And it's been eating me up inside. I don't even know if I should be saying this." She trailed off, and for a moment I thought she might walk away, leaving me with 1,000 unasked questions. But then she took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for whatever was coming next. She paused again, her gaze sharp, her expression a mix of guardedness and vulnerability, an impossible combination that made it hard to look away. The words she finally spoke hit me like a punch to the gut, their weight sweeping over me like a gust of wind. "I think I have feelings for you," she confessed, her voice barely audible. The shock of her words hung in the air, a heavy silence that was impossible to ignore. The next day, I couldn't shake the memory of what she had said. Even as I tried to focus on work, her confession loomed over me, twisting our connection into something I couldn't quite put into words. Hours later, the tension still clung to me like a shadow. Around noon, I was sprawled on the couch, phone pressed to my ear, listening to a friend talk about his latest project. I nodded along, barely paying attention to half of what he was saying, but then she walked into the room. Her face softened with a teasing, almost mischievous smile. I couldn't help but watch her, distracted by her presence, even though I was trying to follow the conversation on the phone. She sat beside me, just close enough that I could feel her warmth. Before I knew it, her fingers were reaching over, darting toward my sides in quick, playful movements. I jumped, trying to stifle a laugh as her fingers found my ticklish spots, those spots I'd long tried to ignore. I half-heartedly shrugged her off, mumbling a strained "hang on, I'm talking to someone" while trying to maintain a straight face. Her laugh was quiet, and her eyes sparkled with the knowledge of exactly what she was doing to me. She didn't stop, her fingers were relentless, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Finally I gave in, laughing quietly, mouthing to her, "Stop it." She ignored me, locking eyes with me, holding my gaze with a familiarity that felt dangerously close to something I wasn't ready to face. By the time I managed to wrap up the call and hang up, my heart was racing faster than I wanted to admit. I turned to her, a mix of frustration and amusement in my voice. "You know I was on the phone, right?" I said, half joking, though I was trying to cover up the rush of emotions I was feeling. She tilted her head slightly, smirking as she met my gaze. "I couldn't resist," she replied casually. But the way she said it, there was an underlying tension that brought up the memory of the conversation we'd had the night before. The air between us shifted again, and I could feel the same tension I'd felt when she first entered the room the night before. That same awareness drawing me in, making me wonder where all of this was leading. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stayed close, her eyes never leaving mine, her hand resting on my arm just a moment longer than necessary. Without thinking, I leaned in. I barely realized what I was doing until our faces were just inches apart. My mind raced, a flood of thoughts colliding in those few seconds. This was the moment to pull back, to laugh it off, to say something that would break the tension, but I couldn't. I was stuck, caught between the decision to turn away or give in. Before I even had time to think it through, our lips met in a brief, soft kiss, and in that instant, it felt like all my doubts and reasons for holding back vanished. It wasn't a kiss full of promises or declarations. It was tentative, as if we were both trying to feel our way through something unfamiliar, testing the waters of this strange new territory. Her breath mingled with mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink quieter, like nothing existed outside that room. Nothing but the two of us. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air between us, a silent confession. Neither of us spoke. When we finally pulled away, she looked at me, her cheeks flushed. Her face held a mix of uncertainty and something else, something I couldn't quite define. I searched her expression, trying to find the right words, but they escaped me, lost between the thrill of the moment and the reality of what we had just crossed into. "We probably shouldn't have done that," I mumbled, the words barely audible, more like I was trying to convince myself than her. My pulse was still racing, the memory of her lips on mine lingering like a mark I couldn't shake off. She looked away, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and her voice was barely a murmur. "Probably not," she agreed, absent-mindedly brushing her fingers over the edge of the couch cushion. Neither of us moved. We were both frozen, caught in the weight of what had just transpired. And yet I couldn't ignore the unspoken understanding in her gaze. An admission that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of it. The silence between us felt charged, like we were standing on the edge of something much bigger, something that had been building up for longer than we'd realized. I felt torn, wanting to pull her closer again, but also knowing that stepping deeper into this would complicate things in ways I wasn't ready to face. Finally, she looked at me, her lips curving into a small, almost teasing smile. "Well, I guess you'll have to get used to me being around," she said, a playful edge to her voice. But her eyes held a seriousness that sent another jolt through me. There was no way to know what would come next, but in that moment, as we sat so close yet so uncertain, I realized there was no going back to how things had been. We'd crossed a line, and now the only question was whether we were ready to face what would come after. In the days that followed, it felt like everything had shifted, yet we acted as though nothing had changed. We tread carefully, not daring to bring up the kiss that hung between us unspoken. But the memory of it lingered, catching me off guard during quiet moments, making me question every glance, every smile. I found myself watching her more closely, noticing things I hadn't before. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the smirk that would appear when she thought no one was watching, the way her laugh softened when I was near. I knew it was silly to be thinking about her like this, but I couldn't help myself. Every time we were in the same room, the air grew heavier, thick with the unspoken tension. She would glance my way, and sometimes our eyes would meet, lingering just a moment too long before one of us looked away. And though I tried to ignore it, I could tell she felt it too. One evening, as I was making dinner, she strolled into the kitchen with her usual easy grin. She leaned against the counter, watching me chop vegetables, and for a moment, everything felt strangely normal. Her presence was oddly comforting, as if we'd silently agreed to let things be. But as I turned to grab a bowl, I saw her reaching for the can of whipped cream I had set aside for dessert. I raised an eyebrow, amused. "Seriously? That's for later," I said, already knowing she'd ignore me. She just laughed, her eyes lighting up with playful mischief. "Couldn't resist," she shrugged, pressing the nozzle and letting a small mountain of cream land on her finger before quickly tasting it. "Besides," she added, glancing up at me, "you know I have a weakness for this stuff." I couldn't help but roll my eyes, a grin tugging at my lips despite myself. She was so unapologetically herself, so confident, it was impossible to stay annoyed. "One day, I'm going to make you wait," I teased, pointing the spoon in her direction. "Or I might just stop sharing." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing in playful challenge. "Oh please," she said, laughing. "You'd never make it." Her voice was light, teasing. But there was something in the way she looked at me that made me hesitate. A quiet pause between us, the memory of our last kiss resurfacing. I swallowed, trying to shake it off, but the tension between us only thickened. She turned, settling on a bar stool across from me, and started chatting about her day, filling the space with casual stories. I listened, half-focused but fully aware of how close she was, how her presence seemed to fill every corner of the room. Her laughter echoed around us, and the ease of it felt like a sharp contrast to the heaviness of my thoughts. Then out of nowhere, she reached across the counter, lightly brushing my arm. Her fingers brushed my skin for only a second, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. A reminder of everything left unsaid. She quickly pulled her hand back, but I saw the blush rising in her cheeks, and I knew she felt it too. I tried to act casual, stirring the sauce on the stove, but I could feel her gaze burning into my back. Finally, I set the spoon down and turned to face her, unable to ignore the tension any longer. She looked up, surprised, and for a moment we just stared at each other, both hesitant to make the first move. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, filling the silence. "Are we just not going to talk about it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and once they were spoken I couldn't take them back. Her expression softened and she searched my eyes. "I don't know," she admitted, a small, almost sad smile curving her lips. "Maybe it's better if we don't," she said. I wanted to argue, to tell her that pretending nothing had happened wasn't the solution, but the right words never came. Instead, I just nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and disappointment. She turned back to the whipped cream, taking another small taste, as if the sweetness could distract her from the tension building between us. In that moment, I realized how complicated things had become. We were walking on thin ice, something fragile that could break at any second if we weren't careful. And yet, part of me didn't want to be careful. I wanted to let the tension continue to grow, to see where it would lead us, even if it meant risking everything. As we finished dinner, the atmosphere seemed to calm, but the unspoken words were still there, hanging in the air. She kept stealing glances at me, her smile lingering a little too long, her laugh just a little too bright. And I found myself leaning into it, letting the warmth of her presence fill the space between us, as if that could make everything simpler. Later, as I cleaned up, she wandered back into the kitchen, looking almost sheepish. "Thanks for letting me eat half the dessert," she said with a grin, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "I owe you." I shrugged, unable to stop the smile that crept onto my face. "You can owe me another time," I replied, trying to keep the tone light, though I knew there was more beneath it. She nodded, her gaze flicking to the floor, and for a moment I thought she might say something, but instead she whispered a soft good night and turned to leave. Her footsteps were almost silent on the floor as she disappeared down the hall. The silence settled in, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The memory of her laughter lingered, mixing with the bittersweet taste of everything left unsaid. A few days later we found ourselves alone again. This time it was a cool autumn evening, with leaves falling gently around us, swirling in the breeze that cut through the stillness. We were supposed to be helping with some family errand, something neither of us wanted to do, but we'd both found an excuse to slip away. We ended up on an empty park bench beneath a street lamp, its soft glow casting a quiet light over everything. The air was crisp and clear, the kind that made buried emotions feel alive again. And I could already sense that familiar tension creeping back between us. It was impossible to ignore, no matter how hard we tried to act casual. She was talking about something trivial. A movie she'd watched recently maybe, or a story about a friend. Her voice had that forced lightness, betraying the discomfort she was trying to hide. I nodded along, responding without really listening, my mind elsewhere, replaying every moment we'd shared over the past few weeks, all the things we hadn't said. I could feel her eyes on me, her gaze intense, as though she was waiting for something, though I wasn't sure what. Eventually, her words trailed off, leaving only the quiet hum of the evening around us. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and fiddled with her scarf, clearly uncomfortable, and I knew we were both thinking about the same thing. The silence between us grew heavier, thick with everything left unsaid, and my heart was pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, I took a deep breath and finally broke the quiet. Look, about everything that's been happening, I started, my voice more uncertain than I meant it to be. We can't just keep ignoring it. Her gaze dropped to the ground, her face softening. She looked almost vulnerable, a stark contrast to her usual confident self. For a moment I felt guilty, like I was cornering her, forcing her into a conversation she wasn't ready for. But then she looked up, meeting my eyes with a calm resolve I hadn't expected. "I know," she whispered, "but I don't know what to do about it either." There was a sadness in her voice, a sense of helplessness that mirrored my own. "Maybe it's better if we just pretend nothing happened," she added, though there was no conviction in her words. I shook my head, frustration building. "How can we pretend?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. Whatever this is, it's real. We can't just pretend it doesn't matter." The words hung in the air, sharp against the still night, and I instantly regretted the edge in my tone. She flinched, her expression hardening. "Do you think I haven't thought about that?" She shot back, her voice laced with frustration. "Do you think I don't know how complicated this is?" Her words hit me hard and I took a step back, feeling the weight of everything we'd been carrying. The hurt in her eyes made me realize just how deeply this had affected both of us. How we'd been trying to ignore something that refused to stay buried. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself as if shielding against the cold. But I knew it wasn't just the chill in the air that made her shiver. For a moment she seemed like she might walk away, to end this once and for all. But then she turned back, her expression softer, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen it. Maybe we just need to be honest," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "No more pretending." The vulnerability in her words broke through my own defenses, and before I could stop myself, I moved closer. Her breath caught as I reached for her hand, our fingers intertwining in a way that felt both familiar and new. The space between us dissolved, leaving only the warmth of her hand in mine, the quiet intimacy of the moment. Without another word, I leaned in, our lips meeting in a kiss that was gentle, almost tentative, as if we were both testing the limits of this fragile connection. It was nothing like the first kiss. This one felt real, grounded, like we were finally acknowledging the truth we'd both been running from. Her lips were soft and warm against mine, and I could feel her heartbeat in sync with mine. We pulled away slowly, our foreheads resting together, neither of us willing to break the silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. This is a mess, isn't it?" She laughed softly, the sound tinged with both sadness and relief, and I couldn't help but smile faintly. "Yeah," I replied, my voice just as soft. "But maybe it doesn't have to be." The words felt both comforting and uncertain, like a promise we weren't sure we could keep. We stayed like that for a while, lost in the quiet comfort of each other's presence, as if the world around us had faded, leaving only the two of us in this small stolen moment. But eventually, the weight of reality began to settle in, reminding us of the impossible nature of what we were doing. She pulled back slightly, her gaze shifting into the distance. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice heavy with sadness, and it hit me in a way I hadn't expected. "It's too complicated. People won't understand." I wanted to argue, to insist that we could find a way through it, but the words just wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew she was right. No matter how much I hoped we could somehow make it work, the obstacles were too big, the risks too risky. But still, I couldn't bring myself to let her go. I don't have all the answers, I said quietly, my voice almost lost in the silence. But I know I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name. For a brief moment, I thought she might say the one thing that could make all of this clear, make everything fall into place. But instead she sighed, a soft, resigned sound that felt like it cut through me. We'll figure it out, she said, but there was no conviction behind it, just uncertainty. Or maybe we won't, she added, her voice bitter, the laughter that followed hollow. I felt the weight of her doubt settle between us, thick and suffocating. The night air grew colder, sharp against my skin, and I realized we were standing on the edge of something huge, something uncharted. Whatever came next was going to change everything. Her eyes were on me, a mixture of hope and fear reflecting back at me, and I felt the weight of what we were both risking. The fragile thing we were trying to hold on to seemed so delicate, like it could fall apart in an instant. In that moment, I wanted to say everything. Tell her how much she meant to me, how much I wanted this to work, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I reached out and took her hand, offering what little comfort I could in that moment. Whatever happens, I said, my voice calm but uncertain, we'll face it together. Her hand gripped mine tighter, and for a brief moment I thought that was enough. But deep down, I knew we were standing at a crossroads, and whatever lay ahead wouldn't be easy. It wasn't long before our parents suggested the family trip, a getaway they hoped would bring us all together, free from the weight of everyday life. I knew we couldn't turn it down without raising suspicion, so we agreed. The thought of spending an entire weekend under the same roof, in such close quarters, felt like both a gift and a burden. I told myself we'd keep our distance, that we'd make it through without letting our guard slip. But somewhere deep inside, I knew it wouldn't be so simple. The weekend started with an awkward kind of tension. The house was a secluded cabin by a lake, its rustic charm adding to the stillness of the surroundings, only deepening the silence between us. The first night, we all sat together, our parents laughing and reminiscing about stories we had all heard too many times. She and I exchanged brief, polite glances, keeping the distance that had become familiar over the past few days. But I couldn't help but catch her eyes, and I saw it. The same hesitation, the same pull between us that had been there all along. I knew she felt it too. The second day was filled with forced activities meant to bring us closer. Or so our parents thought. Hiking through the woods, playing board games by the fire, doing anything to seem like a family. The effort to keep things normal was exhausting, the tension simmering under every word, every shared glance. She stayed near our parents, laughing at all the right times, looking like she was having a good time. But every so often I'd catch a flicker of something in her eyes, something that told me she was just as unsettled as I was. That evening after dinner we managed to slip away, retreating to the quiet of the garden outside the cabin. The night air was cold, the scent of pine thick in the air, and the only sound was the occasional chirp of crickets. For a long while neither of us spoke. We stood side by side, letting the silence stretch out, watching as the sky darkened and stars slowly began to appear. I finally broke the stillness. This weekend's harder than I thought it would be. She nodded, her gaze distant, and I could tell she was lost in her own thoughts. I thought I could handle it, she said softly. But every time I look at you, it's like I forget how to breathe. I feel like I'm not even me anymore when I'm around you. Her words landed heavier than I expected, stirring something deep inside me. A strange blend of relief and sadness. I reached out, brushing my fingers against hers in a hesitant touch that felt as delicate as the moment itself. Maybe we're just trying too hard to pretend, I said quietly, wishing somehow that saying it aloud would make it easier. She turned to face me, her expression torn between conflicting emotions. I feel it too, she said. But what else can we do? This isn't something we can just ignore, and every time I try to act normal, I feel like I'm betraying both of us. Her gaze locked with mine, steady and intense. I could see the weight of it all in her eyes. Before I could speak, the sound of footsteps approaching from the cabin made us both pull back, instantly slipping back into our roles, putting on our masks of casual indifference. The moment was gone, and with it, the brief comfort of being honest. That night, everyone turned in early, worn out from the day's events. I tried to sleep, but the ceiling above me remained just as blank and unfocused as my mind. I couldn't stop replaying everything, the glances, the words left unspoken, the tension that had been building. I knew I couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep walking this line between what I wanted and what was realistic. But the weight of our situation was undeniable, looming over me like a storm cloud. Just when I thought I would spend the entire night lost in thought, I heard a soft knock at my door. I knew exactly who it was before I even opened it. She stood there, bathed in the dim light from the hallway, her face unreadable. She didn't need to say anything. We both knew why she was there. We both knew why we couldn't keep pretending. I let her in, quietly shutting the door behind us. We stood there for a moment, silently watching each other in the dim light. The tension between us was palpable, thick and heavy. My pulse quickened as I realized what this meant, that this was the point of no return. Without a word, I reached for her, our hands meeting, fingers intertwining. It felt like relief, like finally letting go of something we'd both been resisting for too long. She looked up at me, her gaze unwavering, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Then, almost as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she leaned in. Our lips met in a kiss that carried the weight of everything we hadn't said, all the moments we had kept hidden. It wasn't hurried or frantic. It was steady, as though we were both finally acknowledging the truth that had been there from the start. Her warmth, her closeness felt like an anchor, grounding me in a way that made everything else fade away for a moment. In that space, it was just us, free from the world outside, free from the doubts and fears that had kept us apart. When we finally pulled away, her eyes held a mixture of hope and sadness. She didn't need to say anything. The look in her eyes said it all. This was real, but it was also impossible. We both knew it, even as we stood there, holding on to each other in the quiet dark. Slowly, she stepped back, her fingers slipping from mine, and I felt a sharp pang of loss as the distance between us grew once more. She offered a faint, bittersweet smile, and I knew she felt the same weight, the same inevitability of what hung over us. There was no turning back, but moving forward didn't seem possible either. "Good night," she whispered, barely audible. And before I could reply, she turned and left, the soft click of the door echoing in the stillness, leaving me standing there, alone in the quiet of the room. The reality of what had just happened settled over me, heavy and relentless. We had crossed a line, one that could never be undone or ignored. Deep down, I knew there were no simple answers, no way to undo the choices we had made. All I could do was hope that somehow we'd find a way to face what lay ahead, even as the weight of uncertainty pressed down on us, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. I realized then that love, no matter how powerful, didn't always come with clear paths or happy endings. Sometimes it was nothing more than a series of impossible choices, leaving us to try and piece together the mess we had made along the way. Returning to the city felt strange, as if the world had shifted, leaving us stuck between the reality we once knew and everything we'd left unspoken. Days passed, each one dragging with the weight of the distance between us. We'd crossed a line that had blurred a boundary I thought would bring us closer, but it had only pushed us into silence. The air grew thicker with the weight of what we had done, with everything we hadn't addressed. Even in passing, it was there. I wanted to talk to her, to make sense of this strange limbo we now found ourselves in, but she seemed distant. Her gaze would slip away each time I tried to catch it, and there was something new in her eyes, a look I couldn't place. It wasn't anger, but it certainly wasn't the warmth I had grown used to. She was pulling away, and I felt it in every moment, like a loss growing each day, widening the space between us. One evening, unable to stand the silence any longer, I texted her, asking if we could talk. Hours passed with no response. Finally, around midnight, my phone lit up with a message. It was short and to the point, her tone colder than I expected. "Meet me by the river." The river had always been our quiet place, a spot where we'd wander during late-night talks, covering everything from our dreams to our families to whatever else was on our minds. But tonight, everything felt different. The night air was sharp, and the world felt eerily still. As I stood alone beneath the dim street lamps reflecting off the water, I saw her approach. Her steps were slow, hesitant, and I felt a rush of anticipation mingled with something close to fear. She stopped a few feet away, her hands buried in her pockets, her gaze fixed on the ground. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she lifted her eyes to meet mine, searching them as if trying to find something there, something she could hold on to. "We need to stop this," she said finally, her voice barely above the sound of the river flowing beside us. Her words hit me like a punch and I felt my chest tighten, a hollow ache spreading through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. Her gaze remained steady, but her eyes were sad. Whatever this is between us, it's not something we can keep doing," she said. "I thought we could find a way, but it's just too much for both of us." Frustration surged through me, and desperation followed. "We don't have to end it," I said. "We could figure it out somehow. I don't want to pretend none of this happened." She looked away, her expression hardening. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we're both just clinging to something we shouldn't be," she said sharply, though her voice trembled with the weight of her own feelings. I stepped closer, reaching for her hand, but she pulled back. Her arms crossed defensively over her chest, the distance between us now feeling vast. An invisible wall she had built brick by brick, and I felt powerless to break it. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I could, but it's tearing me apart. We're hurting ourselves and each other." Her eyes shimmered with a raw emotion, barely held back, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. I wanted to argue, to tell her we could make it work, that what we had was worth fighting for. But the look in her eyes told me she had already made up her mind. She looked at me as though she had come to terms with something I wasn't ready to accept, and that realization stabbed through me, twisting in my chest. "Is this really what you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She nodded, swallowing hard, though her eyes betrayed her. "It's what we need," she said, her tone resolute. "We can't keep pretending this won't destroy us." There was finality in her words, and it was like trying to breathe under a weight too heavy to bear. I felt the weight of everything we had shared, all of it pressing down on me. The stolen moments, the quiet nights of whispered conversations, all of it slipping away like sand through my fingers. "I don't know how to let you go," I admitted, the vulnerability I had tried to keep hidden spilling out in those few simple words. She gave me a sad smile, the kind that spoke of regret and understanding. "Maybe we don't have a choice," she said. The words hung in the air between us, final, irreversible. And I knew she was right, even though my heart rebelled against it. She took a step back, the distance between us widening, her expression resolute yet heartbreaking. Just before she turned to leave, she looked back, her gaze lingering on me as if she wanted to remember me like this, in this moment. And then as she walked away, everything I hadn't said, every choice left unmade, filled the space between us. I stood there, the night air cold against my skin, watching her disappear into the darkness, feeling as though I was losing a part of myself. I felt the weight of everything we hadn't said, the words we didn't speak, the path we didn't take. As I turned to leave, a question echoed in my mind, relentless and haunting. Was it better to have loved and lost, or had we been foolish to think we could rewrite the boundaries that had always been there? The answer slipped away just out of reach like she had. And I was left to wonder if love, with all its beauty and pain, was ever meant to be ours to keep.